Barack Obama's rise to presidency is a Cinderella story. Now here's an example of how Sir Hale unpacks a series of viewpoints, and I'll have to tell you what's missing off the bottom. But he takes the thing that you see is what he calls the litany. So if we take famine as something that we see in developing countries, some people see that as a problem of too many people and a lack of family planning. Their worldview is usually something like less advanced nations need some help so they can be like us. And the sorts of metaphors and stories they tell tend to be us and them type stories, portraying other nations as kind of other. A very strong thread that runs through human society, even going to the point of demonising other cultures as a way of making ourselves feel special. So that's one interpretation. Another interpretation of famine is that it's a lack of women's power. If women had more control over their own destinies, we wouldn't have the population problem. And these people have a worldview that is about challenging whether male-dominated societies are such a great thing. And the stories they tell will be maybe about women's rights or about men and women working in partnership rather than having male domination. A third viewpoint on famine is that it's about inadequate environmental resources. These people will have a worldview that's about notions of economic growth and economic growth not taking into account the environment, and the stories they tell will be about justice and limits to growth. So here you've got three very different worldviews, three very different explanations of what looks like a simple phenomenon, and each of these groups will have a different solution. First group, family planning. Second group, do something about women's power. Third group, get better environmental policies. And so every issue that we're dealing with has got this complexity that we're all seeing it in a different way. And if we don't stop to ask ourselves, well, who is this an issue for, and who are we trying to solve the problem for, then we're just going to make dealing with that complexity a whole lot harder. So one simple example that I'm very familiar with is coastal policy in Australia. The Minister for the Environment, when I was working there, wanted a national approach to coastal development. And when you talk to him about why he wanted that, he was a sailor. He saw the coast from the ocean and he was concerned about more and more houses along the coastline. You talk to other people and they say, oh no, it's not about that, it's about more and more people coming to live in the coastal areas and it's getting too crowded and the waterways are getting polluted, and other people will say, no, it's about low-income people who can't afford to live in cities being forced to move to the coast and having to live on the outskirts in poverty. And then another group of people say, well, actually, and these tend to be the local government people, all of this adds up to a problem for us because we are getting more and more people and less rates per person, which means we need to provide hospitals and education and transport and roads, and we don't have the money to do it. So again, there's what seems like a simple policy issue that's seen very differently from a number of different points of view. As I say, unless we think about how different people are interpreting the problem, it makes it very difficult to solve it. In your notes, there's some stuff about the black-footed ferret. This is just one example of conservation programs. There's a long history of conservation programs failing around the world because they're put in place by scientists who come up with a really good scientific way of saving a species, and they forget to think about the vested interests that are going to stop that program being put into place, or the economic drivers that might push their plan in a different direction. One of the other areas, or I guess complementary approaches that's become popular over the last 10, 20 years is systems thinking. Earlier last century, the discipline of systems analysis developed, and then when was it? It was the 1970s, I think, or a little bit, maybe the 80s. Peter Senge at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published this book, The Fifth Discipline, which was encouraging people to take a systems view of the world, because he said that all the things that I've been saying already, that if we don't think about systems, we blunder in thinking we know the system, we intervene, and we have unintended consequences. And one of the things that he brought to this was a series of system archetypes, as he called them, which were models of the way systems work. So that when you were dealing with a particular situation, you could go and look at these and say, which sort of situation might I be in? So this one here, you've got, I know you can't read it very well, but you've got the problem in the middle. And one way you can deal with that problem would be to address the symptoms. And if you do that, there's your symptomatic response, you actually end up in a cycle that makes the problem worse, and you actually start to get side effects. This is the sort of model that's often used to think about drug addiction, that you treat the symptom and end up making the problem worse. The alternative is to look at what's really causing the problem, what's the underlying cause, and by addressing that, you solve the problem and reduce the side effects. So that was where, and systems thinking has become really embedded in business thinking. As you can see from the subtitle of this book, it became part of what was known as the learning organisation, a whole strategy of business that said we need to be constantly learning as we move forward. Don't pretend we know what the future is going to be like. Don't pretend we know how to do everything. Have in place in an organisation the ability to look at ourselves and say, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? How can we learn? Sounds like, it's just plain obvious, but still very few organisations do it well. Now, a little bit sort of building on that is this idea of how do we deal with complex adaptive systems where we've got people in them that are making decisions. And this is where the field of agent-based modelling came to the fore. The agents are the people, the players in the game, if you like. And allied to this is game theory and a whole lot of other stuff. This is an example from some work that was done in North America, in Wisconsin, based around the lake system up there. And I thought it would show up a bit better than this, but it doesn't really matter. What we've got in here, oh, I know what's wrong. I need to go to the next one, which is a bit bigger. There's two models that they've looked at. One is one that's got a market manager in it, somebody who's managing the system based on the market. And so their decisions are affecting all the other bits. So you've got the environment where things are happening. You've got a process for gathering information about what's happening in the lakes. And then you've got the behaviour of the people that are involved, and part of that is the market affecting it. Now, the interesting thing about these lake systems is that every so often they suddenly, for what seemed to be a no apparent reason, became highly polluted, just overnight. And people were scratching their heads and saying, how can this happen? Well, it's a complex system that involves fertiliser and other nutrients flowing off the agricultural land into the lake. It builds up in the sediment at the bottom of the lake until it gets to a point where there's some sort of a disturbing event, and the phosphorus is released, and suddenly there's a burst of algae and plankton and what have you, and you get this big pollution event. Now, although it's a complex system, in the sense that you can't really predict when it's going to happen, it's reasonably well understood. And the interesting thing about this model and the next one, which was one where you've got a governing board here that's taking all this assessment information and making decisions about it, but with both of these models, you could not get to a situation where you avoided that pollution event. And the reason was that the way people think, they wait till they get the information, they wait till they're really convinced something's going to happen, and then they act, and it's too late. And there's more and more of these agent-based models that have been done around the world, and they all come up with the same with decision-making, that even when we start to understand these complex systems, it's really hard for us to react to early warning signs to avoid the problems. A lot better than we are not trying to understand the systems. Okay, now I want to say something quickly about scenario planning, which is, again, one of the popular approaches that's used in business. And it's a very misunderstood, happens to be the approach that I do a lot of work on at the moment. So I'm a bit of an advocate of it. But I'm also constantly amazed at why people are uncomfortable with it. It was refined, it basically came out of strategy thinking in World War II. World War II was a very rapid war. It was probably the first war where things happened so fast that you didn't have time to wait and see what the enemy was doing before you responded. You had to imagine what they might do and have several strategies developed. That was